I'm Erica Zavaleta, and this is Ecosystems of California. We're at Strathern Ranch today, a working ranch in the Diablo Range, which is part of the mountains that run north to south between the Pacific Ocean and the Central Valley. The landscapes here are a mixture of blue oak, valley oak, and interior live oak woodlands with riparian zones like this containing sycamores and other species like that. California is home to 8 tree species of oaks, several of which are found only in the state. And there are many other oak species here, probably about 20 in all, that don't attain tree size and form. But what defines an oak woodland, like this landscape behind me, is the presence of tree-sized oaks. So there are oak savannas, which are mainly grassland and have just scattered trees in them, typically 10% tree cover. So oak savannas grade into oak woodlands, which are systems where anywhere from 10 or 20 to 60% of the canopy cover, when you're looking at them from the air, is made up of tree-sized oaks. And then the rest of the vegetation in an oak woodland can be grassland species like the ones here. I'm surrounded by a whole lot of native tarweeds and other parts of this landscape. This would also include grasses and other wildflower species. And then in other kinds of oak woodlands, the understory might be more shrubby species such as chaparral or coastal sage scrub. Oak woodlands also intergrade with montane forests in the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas. So gray pines, for example, become co-dominant with black oaks, Quercus cloggii, as you get up into the beginning of the elevations where you find montane forests in the Sierras. Historically, California's oak woodlands were more widespread. They've been and continue to be threatened by development and clearing. And they face more recent challenges from invasive disease, competition from exotic plants, and climate change. But oak woodlands in California remain a widespread and varied ecosystem type, with the oaks acting as foundation species through both the habitat and structure they provide and the role that they play in oak woodland food webs, largely through their acorns, but also through other parts of the tree. Here's a ground squirrel colony, and here's one of their burrows. Ground squirrels are another animal that makes a living largely off of eating acorns in oak woodlands. They in turn serve as important food for a lot of other animals like foxes and bobcats. And their burrows, which are really large compared to the animals themselves, sometimes then get repurposed by other animals for their homes. So you'll find sometimes rattlesnakes living in ground squirrel holes. You can find tiger salamanders, which need to spend a lot of their lives underground and are protected in California. And so they use ground squirrel holes a lot and rely on them for protection from heat and desiccation in these systems. And then badgers will sometimes expand an old ground squirrel hole and turn that into a home, maybe after eating the resident. Ground squirrels also, even though they consume a lot of acorns, are another organism that can cache acorns, bury them in the soil for collection and consumption later, but then they'll forget or never collect some of those acorns and put them into ideal places for those acorns to germinate successfully, because they're putting them in that moist environment in the soil where they also can get protected from desiccation and maybe germinate more successfully as a result. In the last 10 years, we've taken a more comprehensive look at valley and blue oak regeneration. And on many of these active ranches, blue and valley oak regeneration is actually better than in the protected reserves where many earlier studies were focused. So we have a picture now of blue and valley oaks doing better than we thought they might be. There are a lot of these landscapes where you see big old trees and no young seedlings or saplings, which led a lot of people to be concerned about the future of these oaks. And there are a lot of hypotheses for why they might be failing to regenerate. Fire suppression, competition from invasive grasses, predation of acorns by feral pigs, browsing by cattle, deer and rabbits, lots of different things that could have been contributing to that. But it turns out that although cattle grazing can sometimes directly impact oaks because the cattle can eat oak seedlings, they also can, in the landscapes in the parts of the state where there's enough moisture, they can help suppress competition by what would be potentially head-high stands of exotic annual grasses, because they graze all that down preferentially. And by doing that, they make it actually quite a bit easier for acorns to reach the soil. And that's also true because they do all of this trampling on the ground. And they're also just reducing light competition, reducing the removal of surface soil water by those exotic grasses by grazing them down, and maybe also freeing up nutrients for the oaks to consume. So it turns out that if cattle are moved frequently enough and stocked at low enough densities, especially if they're pulled off of places in the summer, they can actually lead to more regeneration of oaks than we would have seen otherwise, now that we have all these exotic annual grasses and have lost some of the native grazers. So in California, there's two major groups of the tree-sized oaks, and they have really different strategies for dealing with the seasonality of climate in the state. So here at Strathern Ranch, we have live oaks. This is one of probably 3 that we can find here on the ranch. There's coast live oak, interior live oak, and canyon live oak. And this is an evergreen oak species, like all of the live oaks. So it's keeping its leaves year-round. Part of what you see here at Strathern is that these live oaks are growing in relatively shaded canyon bottoms and places like that, because an evergreen strategy to some extent requires that this tree be able to be year-round active and taking up water, photosynthesizing. So here's a little valley oak, and this is one of the deciduous oak species we have in California. And the interesting thing about the deciduous tree-sized oaks here is that they're winter deciduous, so more like trees that you would find in a typical continental seasonal regime elsewhere in North America. They're set up to be active in the summer and inactive in the winter. The interesting thing about that strategy here is that in California, a lot of plants have evolved a summer deciduous habit, and that allows them to be leafless when it's really dry and then leafed out in the winter when it's wet. The oaks that are deciduous are sticking with a strategy of having their leaves out when there are long days and warm temperatures. And part of that may have to do with their being able to, at some point, as they reach larger size, tap permanent groundwater. So they're accessing water year-round because they can have these deeper roots. If they are not to that groundwater yet, if they're saplings or seedlings, that can make them really sensitive to changes in the height of the groundwater table or to changes in the seasonality and amount of rainfall over time, because it means that they're squeezed between water availability in the spring as they're leafing out and the opportunity to photosynthesize as the summer comes along. So it makes them possibly really sensitive to climate change. Here's some insect galls growing on this oak. So there are about 200 species of cyprinid wasps in California, and there are all these different wasp species that make different galls. Each species has its own particular gall, and many of them make their galls on oaks. So what these galls are is actually wood tissue from the tree itself, and the wasp hijacks the tree's own growth process and causes it to form this great little hibernaculum for the wasp. So we've broken that one open, and you can see all this sort of light, frassy wood. And then here is either the wasp larva or maybe it's still an egg mass. I'm not really sure, but the wasp has already done its thing in here. Here's a western scrubjay feather. It's a little hard for us to find a bird and catch it on camera in the middle of the day, but the western scrubjay, more than any other animal in these oak woodland systems, is playing an important role in both consuming acorns. It'll cache on the order of 5,000 acorns every year, and then also dispersing the oaks, because when it scatter hoards, it's caching thousands of acorns all over the landscape, and then it's not retrieving on the order of half of those. So all of those other acorns are conveniently dispersed over the landscape and buried in a little bit of mineral soil so that they can successfully germinate and then stay moist in the early stages of growth to survive to the seedling stage. And so there are western scrubjays and other scatter hoarding animals that do that same work for the oaks. Include the yellow-billed magpie, which is mainland California's only true endemic bird, and then things like ground squirrels and acorn woodpeckers, which cache acorns more centrally, but also move them around quite a bit and consume and depend on them for their food. So this is cool. So here's a natural seep, and even though it's July and we've had a couple of years straight of serious drought in California, there's still standing water on the surface here. And these water sources are really important in the context of a dry landscape like this for animals. And right now there are a bunch of yellow jackets here, but I'm sure that there are also animals like bobcats coming down here to get water. And then it also is kind of emblematic of this other phenomenon in these particularly these more southerly, dry oak woodlands, where because California has gotten hotter and drier over the last several decades, the niche for regeneration of some of these oak species is just a narrower slice of the adult niche that you see. So in places where it is hotter and drier, seedlings aren't going to germinate anymore up on these dry south-facing slopes where the adults are occurring. They're going to be looking for places kind of more like this, places with more moisture, maybe north-facing, maybe with some water near the surface. And when I say looking for, what I mean is that those acorns that fall in a place that's more protected like this have a better shot at surviving these drier, longer, hotter summers than acorns that are falling out on the dry hill slopes. In spite of some of the challenges that they face, oak woodlands still harbor a big proportion of California's biological diversity, with thousands of invertebrate species and plant species, and many, many vertebrates as well, depending on them and depending on the oaks as the foundations of this system. If you look out over this landscape, it looks a lot like California might have looked a couple of hundred years ago, maybe except for that ranch house. Another thing you can see up here is that part of the way that oak woodlands harbor so much diversity is that the trees themselves create these islands that are different from the surrounding area, and you can kind of see that best right now on the slopes to my right. And you can see how they look different. There are these sort of circles of grayer area underneath the trees, and right now I think that's mainly because the cattle mainly have been sitting under the trees in the shade, but in the winter those are also shadier, moister places, and so different plant species can establish there and be successful than can in the open areas around the trees. And part of that moisture underneath the trees is because of the shade. Part of it's also because it turns out these oaks can bring up groundwater with their deeper roots, and then especially at night they can leak some of it out of their shallower roots, and in that way provide more moisture to the other species and organisms in the system, so they can subsidize them with their hydraulic redistribution. So these are metates, and you can see a whole row of them along the fence here. Apparently when the current owners bought the property, there were dozens of them that had been collected from the oak woodland landscapes around here. And what's cool about these is that native Californians throughout the state used acorns as a food, and in order to be able to consume them, they'd use these manos to grind the acorns, and then that acorn meal would have to be leached to get out the tannins, and then it could be made into a variety of things. And still, you can see how important a food source this was to people right in this area, because there are so many of these around. So this is pretty cool. Typically, acorn woodpeckers will use a dead, standing trunk of an oak tree as a granary to store acorns in, but you can see here that some acorn woodpeckers decided to use the side of this barn. I'm sure that the owners aren't thrilled with this. So what the woodpecker's doing is just making these little storage holes and popping acorns in there to keep. So, you know, out in the woodlands, when an acorn falls out, that may be an opportunity for it to germinate really far away from its parent tree, and in that way to disperse and spread its genes away from the parent tree on the landscape.